and hopefully you are joining us specifically for the Assessment and Cleanup Application Evaluation Criteria for this year's FY25 Brownfield ARC Competition. ARC stands for Assessment, Revolving Loan Fund, and Cleanup. So today we're going to specifically focus on the Assessment and Cleanup Application Evaluation Criteria. I want to let you know that we are recording today's session, and this session, as well as our slides, will be available on the Region 7 website, and there's a link to that in this presentation. Today's agenda is we're going to quickly run through our introduction. Again, I'm Susan Klein. I also want to thank Tara Vaughn and Idalis Schaefer, who are here helping me with monitoring the chat and with getting everything prepared. So thank you guys. And we're going to walk through a little bit about why we're doing this. There's an overview. It's a briefer overview than was provided last week, and a more detailed one is available in the national recordings, but there is an overview of the assessment and cleanup grants that are available this year. CA stands for cooperative agreements. So I will commonly use the term grant when what we're really talking about are cooperative agreements. We're going to go over the competition timeline, what you need to submit, and the specific evaluation criteria, and then we will wrap up. This call is specific to cleanup and assessment, and next week we will be hosting one for revolving loan funds. Revolving loan fund applications. So why are we doing this? There are some wonderful national presentations, and I hope you've all taken advantage of them. But the purpose of Region 7 series of calls is to help increase your understanding of the application evaluation criteria. We've covered changes in competition in previous years. There's a few that will be identified here, but we did cover that in the last presentation. And we want to make sure you're aware of all the resources that are available to you as you're putting together your application. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say, please read the guidelines. This presentation, the headquarters presentations, none of that supersedes the information that is provided in the grant competition guidelines for the type of grant you are applying for. So please take a moment or take several moments and download those and read them from front to back before you get started on your writing. As I mentioned, today is assessment and cleanup. There are links here for the RLF training that we'll be doing on October 9th. And then we'll do a wrap up on October 15th, just for last minute reminders on things you need to be getting together if you haven't already, and some frequently asked questions. I've mentioned there's a series of wonderful videos that have been put together by the Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization, OBLR, in EPA headquarters. These are available on the EPA Brownfields website. These first recordings that I have links for here present the grant minimum requirements. So this is going to walk through what we commonly call the threshold requirements that you're going to need to provide information on in your application. I'm not going to spend much, if any, time on that today, but I want to recommend that you watch that recording, and if you have questions about whether you are eligible or how to respond to one of those threshold responses, you can go ahead and reach out to us, and we can try to help you understand your eligibility. Headquarters OBLR also put on a training for the assessment grants, a little bit similar to what we're doing today, and one for the RLF and cleanup grants. So again, these are good webinars to listen to. And today's webinar is meant to augment these, not replace having attended those. I have already started using numerous acronyms, and in this slide presentation for your reference, we've included some commonly used ones. It's a big alphabet soup. That is what the government does, but I wanted to make sure you at least had a key for the most common ones when you come back and use the slide deck as a reference, which I hope you will. There's a few things I want to point out about all these slides. There are color-coded, mostly consistently color-coded information. So if it's in pink text, that's something that was new or revised for this year's competition, fiscal year 2025, federal fiscal year 2025. from previous competitions. There are some orange text that will emphasize very important points. Of course, red text is things I really want to make sure you're aware of and make sure you understand they're critical or there's something you need to avoid. Also, we have color coded a little bit the community assessment grants in blue, the assessment coalitions in that orangish brown. The states and tribes are in a dark green, and that is for the community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And cleanup grants are in a lighter or brighter green. Also on these slides, there are some boxes, and each of these boxes are meant to highlight something different for you. The ones I want to call your attention to right now is in the blue boxes, there will be information about the criterion that the national evaluators, and we'll talk more what I mean about that later, about how they're going to score your application. That information will be in a blue box. For the home region evaluators, which again, I'll talk about in a few minutes, that information will be in a green box. So if it's a blue box, that means it's going to be in the national ranking panel. If it's a green box, it means it's going to be reviewed by your home region. And then in this instance, it would be us here at Region 7. All right, here's a progress check. I'm going to go ahead and go off camera to make sure we don't overuse our bandwidth. And I will be moving forward. So the next thing I'm going to walk through is an overview of each of these grant types that we're talking about today. So this is an overview of everything that's available this year and the amounts of funding that are available. And I want to point out that there is no cost share this year, thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill Act. So for cleanup, grants do not include a cost share. Who's eligible for these grants or cooperative agreements? Basically, I'm going to let you read the list, but basically it's any governmental entity or some quasi-governmental entities, such as a general purpose unit of local government. And in addition, a 501c3 that does not lobby the federal government. So if under the IRS rules, a 501c3 that does not lobby the government, or a 50c4 that does not lobby the government, and you'll have to demonstrate that. For cleanup, there are also an opportunity for community development entities that, as defined in the IRS code for 45DC1, if you are a community development entity recognized under that section, you are also eligible for cleanup grants, but that is just for cleanup grants. And again, if you have any questions about your eligibility, and if you're a nonprofit or one of these community development entities, and you want to know what you need to do to demonstrate that, and it's not clear in the guidelines, go ahead and contact us. There's also a couple of wonderful charts on EPA's website again that will walk through if you're you have a current Brownfields cooperative agreement with us, and we're talking about assessment, revolving fund, cleanup, or multi-purpose grant with us, then this will walk through what you are eligible to apply for and if there's special conditions on that. There's another chart that walks through your eligibility for multiple applications. So if you're interested in applying for more than one type of grant, it will tell you whether or not you're eligible for that based on a variety of the important factors here. So please use these charts. They're available and on the website if you are confused. I found them very helpful because some of this gets complex pretty fast as you're starting to talk about it. All right, so the first thing I'm going to walk through are the types of assessment grants that are available. For those of you who have been involved in the Brownfields program for a while, you know these things change and can change each year. There is no multi-purpose assessment and cleanup grant available this year. This year, we're going to be offering RLF, Revolving Loan Fund. So we'll be covering that in the next session. But what do we have available in assessment? Well, we have the community-wide assessment for states and tribal governments, and often we call that a CWAG street. CWAGT, and assessment coalitions for a group of eligible entities, a community-wide assessment type grant for an individual entity that's applying on behalf of their community. And we divide those into those who are new to receiving Brownfields grants and those who have existing Brownfields grants. So we try to level the playing field for new players, new applicants, so that they're not competing against the more experienced grant recipients in the program. Turn off that highlighter. There we go. No, it did not go off. Okay. So what can you do with an assessment grant? Hopefully you're aware of this already, but you can inventory your brownfields in your community. You can characterize your sites that you're looking. Look at the past uses. You can do environmental investigations to determine what contamination, if any, is on a brownfield. And you can do some site-specific cleaning plans or area-wide cleanup, area-wide planning and revitalization planning. And we'll talk about that just briefly in a minute. And also you can use these funds to engage your community more holistically in what you're looking at doing with your brownfields. So the planning activities, this was something that was new a couple of years ago, so it's not marked in pink, but I want to mention this. If you are interested, you can use your funds to do a target area. So the area in which you're focusing your brownfields activities, a study for those, or site-specific studies. So this is something you need to think about in advance, whether you want to include this in your application or not. But there are fact sheets that describe kind of what each of these types of studies are available on our website. And we do encourage you to use your resources this way if it is something that would be helpful to your community in revitalizing your brownfields. So let's get into the specific types of grants. The community-wide assessment grants are those in which a entity is applying on behalf of their community, and they're going to begin to address their brownfields challenges, or they're going to take their addressing their brownfields challenges to the next step because they have ongoing efforts for sites investigation and cleanup. That funding is available up to $500,000. Those are 4-year cooperative agreements. And this year, this was something that's new. EPA headquarters has determined they're going to, if we have quality applications, more quality applications than we can fund, we're going to make sure there are at least 3 selected for each region. Again, we're trying to level the playing field here a bit. So assessment coalition grants. These are grants where a lead entity, somebody who's going to receive the grant from us, is partnering with other eligible entities to get a larger assessment grant. So this funding is available up to $1.2 million. And again, they're 4-year grants. But what do we mean by lead and partner? Well, this year, we are requiring that one of the partners be an entity that has not received any type of brownfields grant in the past or assistance. We are no longer requiring that you have a community-based nonprofit organization as a partner. However, we do still encourage that. But we're looking for a lead entity to help other entities that are eligible, but don't have the capacity and wouldn't be able to access these brownfields resources otherwise. One of the requirements I want to point out here is that you must have at least a minimum of 2 sites in each of your members' geographic boundaries. And that is something you will need to be discussing in your application. You must identify a target area in which these sites will be located for each entity, each of the coalition members. And those areas may not overlap. That's one of the things that a couple of applicants have confused in the past. Even if you are a larger geographic entity than your partners, you need to pick a target area that does not overlap with your partners. So I wanted to emphasize that as well. Let's see, move on. Assessment coalition grants, a little bit more information here, and I've already covered a couple of these. But the non-lead members this year, as I mentioned, you are required to have someone that's never received a multi-purpose assessment or revolving loan fund and cleanup grant from EPA. That's what MARC stands for, MARC. If you do have a current grant from us, you must demonstrate that you've drawn at least 70% of the funding for your open MARC grants to be eligible as a non-lead member. So if you want to be a lead member, you can't have an open grant, but if you want to be a non-lead member, you need to have drawn and demonstrate that you have drawn down at least 70% of your funds. Again, that eligibility chart I pointed out it earlier kind of walks you through this a little more clearly, but I wanted to call that to your attention. Now, another key factor is a member of a coalition may not be an agency or instrumentality of themselves. So, for example, you can't be a county and the redevelopment authority of that same county because those are considered the same entity. Or you cannot be a city and be partnering with a economic development organization that is also part of the city. So that's something you want to be aware of. And again, if you're not sure, you can contact us ahead of time and we can talk about the eligibility of your members. And I guess I didn't point out specifically, but you must have at least 2 non-lead members, so that'd be 3 members total, and no more than 4. So you, the applicant, and at least 2 non-lead entities. Community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes. These are up to $2 million. These are things that are only available to states and tribes and tribal related organizations as listed here. You must identify at least 3 target areas, and there must be at least 5 priority sites in the application, at least one of those in each of those target areas. And you must identify target areas that address both your higher and lower population densities. By the time you're done with your grant, you're going to need to have addressed at least 10 sites in underserved communities. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you determine if somebody is underserved as we move forward. And these have a little bit more time for performance. They have up to 5 years. I will take a break in a few minutes to give you guys a chance to ask questions if you have them. So one thing that isn't readily apparent in our guidelines, but I want to make sure before you apply that you're aware of what you might be committing to. So we have something called a sufficient progress award condition. And for each type of grant, they are slightly different. So for assessment community-wide grants, which remember those are 4-year grants, at 18 months, you must demonstrate that you have drawn 25% of your funds and dispersed it, paid whoever incurred those costs for you. And in addition, we're looking for you to have hired your qualified environmental professional, have identified your site priorities if you hadn't identified those in your application, and have started your community engagement. So we're looking for that about at 18 months. Now we understand sometimes there are delays, and this is something you will work closely with your EPA project officer and project manager to document if for some reason outside your control you are having delays. But our goals are 25% by 18 months, and by 30 months in your period of performance, 45% of your funds must be drawn. So we recognize that when you're starting out an assessment grant, you're starting out with phase 1s and a lot of environmental, a lot of work that is preparatory to doing the environmental work, such as your community engagement and hiring your contractor, and also some lower cost activities, which is often the ASTM phase 1 environmental site assessment. So again, 25% and 45%. So when you're looking at doing your timeline, be sure you think about those, if you can have that much drawn at each of these intervals. Assessment coalitions are similar. The one thing that assessment coalition has that is different than a community-wide assessment grant is you must have a memorandum of agreement between all the partners talking about how the resources will be distributed and how decisions will be made among the coalition members. And at 80, we have the same thresholds for expenses to be drawn and dispersed, 40, 25, and 45. And for the assessment coalitions, I hadn't identified this for the community-wide. For community-wide, you have to have started work at least 2 sites. And for an assessment coalition, you must have started at least 3 sites by 30 months. And lastly, the community-wide assessment, last assessment grant anyway, the community-wide assessment for states and tribes have slightly different thresholds, 15% for drawdowns at 18 months and 45% at 30 months. And they have a slightly higher requirement of how many sites you have started at each of those intervals. Let's talk a little bit about cleanup grants. So cleanup grants are, again, as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have an opportunity that was unprecedented before that was passed to offer 3 different levels of cleanup funding. So if you are identifying a site or multiple sites that the cleanup will total up to $500,000, you're going to apply specifically for that tier. If your cleanup or cleanups are going to total up to $2 million, so between $500,000 and $2 million, you're going to apply for that tier. And finally, we'll be giving a lower number, but a higher dollar value. At least we're hoping to award at least 10 $4 million cleanup grants. So you can have multiple sites in cleanup grants, or you can have single sites, but keep in mind those are the level, and you have to commit to the level you are applying for. And again, I mentioned before, there is no cost share for cleanup this year. So cleanup grants are grants that do pretty much what it says. It provides funding for you to clean up the contaminants at a site or sites that you have identified. You can do some cleanup planning, and you can do the cleanup itself. The eligible entity, somebody who's applying for that grant, and we remember we went through that list earlier, that eligible entity, that applicant must own the site at the time of application and throughout the cleanup of the site. So you must own it before you apply for the funding, and you must own it throughout the period of the cleanup activities. These, I've already gone over the levels, and these are also 4-year grants. And that's a duplicative slide. Move along faster. Again, sufficient progress. There is a sufficient progress level for cleanup grants as well. So at 18 months, you need to have identified an appropriate cleanup plan, and it should be in place. And if your site is going to require institutional controls, such as environmental use controls, then you need to be working on getting those set up. You need to have prepared a community engagement plan and started on those activities. You need to make sure you've identified any pre-cleanup requirements that your state or tribal environmental authority that you're going to enroll your site with has identified. Have your qualified environmental professional hired, and have started the solicitation for the actual cleanup contractor. So that's 2 different contractors I'm identifying there. Qualified environmental profession to help oversee the work if you don't have someone in-house to do that, and the actual cleanup contractor itself. At 30 months, we expect to have at least 50% of those cleanup activities completed that are being funded under the grant. And that includes having a quality assurance project plan in place if you are needing to do confirmation sampling or health and safety sampling during the cleanup event, and any other documented activities that your EPA project manager, project officer helps demonstrate your progress under the grant. So again, you're going to work closely with your EPA project manager, project officer, I keep using those terms, they're kind of interchangeable, to make sure that you are on time and on track and meeting these deadlines. And if you can't meet these deadlines, that it's well documented why not, and how those circumstances are out of your control or have been addressed so they're no longer delaying the project. All right, I went through all of that because I think it's important if you're applying for these grants to understand what your commitments are and how we hope you'll be able to schedule and move forward. I am going to take a breath here. Have there been any questions in the chat? Tara or Idalis?
There's no questions yet in the chat.
Okay. Does anybody who is participating have any questions at this time? You may unmute yourself or raise your hand. And it doesn't look like it. So, all right, we can move into some more of the nitty-gritty. Trying to turn off that laser pointer, but I can't figure out how to do it. So I keep dragging across the screen. I apologize for that. All right, so we've gone over the first two sections of our agenda. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual application and the timeline for submitting that. And moving forward, if you are a current grantee, you will have to demonstrate that you have met whatever the drawdown requirements are for the type of grant you are applying for by October 1st. So that is something, if you'll either use documentation that you have, or if you need to request from your project manager a Compass Data Warehouse, which is our financial system report, you may do that, but that needs to be attached to your agreement and demonstrated that you've drawn down those funds and dispersed those funds. If you're applying for a cleanup grant, I want to call your attention to another threshold criterion, because remember, we're not talking about thresholds specifically today, but there is a community notification requirement that must happen 14 days before your application submittal. So not 14 days before November 14th necessarily, but because we hope you submit your application sooner, but 14 days before you submit your application. So that's a community notification where they can review your draft grant and they can look at your analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, which is also a draft, talking about what you hope to do with your cleanup grant, and have an opportunity to provide comment and get a response to comment. So if you've not looked at that and you're planning to apply for cleanup, you're going to want to look at that and get started and be prepared for that so that timing works out. The applications are due November 14th, no later than 11:59 Eastern time. So keep that in mind, that's midnight Eastern, well, a minute before midnight Eastern time. We've had applicants who have attempted to submit their applications late in the evening on the due date, and they had multiple applications, but they only managed to get one in on time. And so we're unable to submit the other. The next step that happens once you've submitted an application is it goes through an EPA review. It's part of what we're going to talk about today. And we're hoping to have an announcement out. It's a little bit out of our control, but the announcement for the new grants, those of you who are selected to receive a grant, is usually mid to late May. Sometimes it slips into June, but usually it's mid to late May. Then we have to turn around and work with the selected applicants to prepare the rest of the grant application forms and the work plan that you'll need to submit. And those have to be finalized pretty quickly in order for us to award the funds before the end of September so that you can have a October start date for your grant. So I hope that answered your question, Andrew, but we're looking at about the same schedule as we had this year. For those of you who are new to this process, and I know some of this is a reminder for some of you who have applied before, but on November 14th, or when you're submitting your application and through November 14th, you must have an active sam.gov account. So if you don't know who's in charge of your sam.gov account for your agency, you need to find out who that is, and you need to make sure that that has been kept active. They have to be renewed each year, I think, and sometimes that can take up to 6 weeks. So make sure to check on that pretty quickly if you haven't already. You'll have obtained a unique entity identifier. We no longer use the, I was just about to say Davis-Bacon, but that's not it. The Dun & Bradstreet numbers, we use a federally assigned unique entity identifier, and you'll get that through sam.gov as well. When you're ready to apply, that will go into grants.gov. So you're going to need to make sure that you associate the correct UEI and you have your designated authorized organization representative identified, because that's who's going to have to push the button when that grant is submitted. So those are tips to get started on right now. Make sure you have that information. This is summed up in some of the tips for submitting Brownfield's grant applications on our website. And I want to remind you that if you have an issue with sam.gov or with grants.gov, you're going to have to go to the administrators for those programs. That is not something EPA can assist you with. What are you submitting? Again, this is outlined in your guidelines, but you're going to be submitting several standard forms, federal standard forms, 424, which is the application form, a 424A budget form, pre-award compliance review form, your key contacts, and then the meat of your application is this project narrative, which is going to have three components: a narrative information sheet, a narrative responses to the ranking criteria, and any required attachments. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those as we go forward. There are some optional forms that you can provide now, or if you're selected, could be provided later. And headquarters put together when I say headquarters, I mean the Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization in Washington, D.C., have put together a group of sample forms to help you know how to fill out those 424s and 424As for your application. So take a look at those sample forms. There's a couple of key things in there that it's useful to know. So please be aware that they're there. I also want to remind you that a work plan is not part of your application. The narrative that's describing your situation and the work you're going to conduct is, but not an actual work plan that would be associated with a grant award. So let's talk a little bit about what you're preparing. I said it was divided into three sections. The narrative information sheet is a 3-page, single-page document where we're specifically telling you what to tell us. Don't add any other information, but be clear about the information we are requiring and put it on your organization's letterhead. That is the organization that will be the recipient of the grant and whose UEI, Universal Identifier, is associated with that organization. So it's important to make sure those things all match up. The narrative information form will have a few attachments. We'll talk about a little bit about what those are, but one of the things I really want to point out, because we've had several applicants who have failed to do this, it's really important to attach a response to all of the threshold criterion to your narrative information sheet. So don't assume that you've told us who you are and you've provided some of that information in your narrative write-up. Be explicit. Attach a document that says threshold criteria and go through them for your type of grant, 1 through whatever the number is, and provide a response. Don't skip any. That's really important. The page limitations are 10 pages for a community-wide assessment grant or a cleanup grant, and 12 pages if you are submitting for a coalition grant or community-wide assessment grant for states and tribes. And that is because we anticipate that there's more target area, more sites to be discussed in those types of applications. We want you to refer to the application submission checklist in your guidelines for the type of grant. I have not stopped to remind you or let you know that there is a specific EPA competition guideline for each of these types of grants we are talking about. So make sure you have the right guidelines. And again, read them from front to back, and this information will be in there. There's also a brief checklist to make sure you're getting all the information that you need. Do not go over these page limits. Any extra pages will be removed, and that will mean your application will likely receive fewer points and not rank as well. This is all the information I mentioned that was covered in those webinars that OBLR put together on the, they didn't call it threshold, they called it something else, but on their basic requirements for a grant webinar. So be sure to listen to the one that you're looking for. I'll get to your question, Andrew, in a minute. So the narrative information sheet, I mentioned this is a 3-page sheet. It does not count as part of your narrative. So that 10 and 12 or 12-page limitation does not apply to this. This doesn't come part of it, but there's some key information that doesn't always get identified, and I want to make sure you put in your application. Make sure you identify the target area or areas and the priority site. So these are things you're going to be discussing in the narrative of your application. Be sure to summarize it here. And we'll tell you a little bit more about what that is. But also, you have to have a letter from your state or tribal environmental authority. It's a different letter, and we'll get to this in a minute. It's a different type of letter if it's from a cleanup grant applicant than it is from an assessment grantee. Be sure to reach out and contact your environmental authority. It needs to be either at the state level or the tribal level early so that you may have that letter in time for your application, because it must be attached. Don't have it sent to me or to Tara or to headquarters. It must be attached to your application. Also, just to let you know, we are going to release your applications, so you will need to identify to us anything that needs to be kept confidential. One thing I want to mention, don't waste your time writing a few paragraphs that summarize your project and put that into the narrative. That will not get reviewed. It will not be read. So just include the information on your letterhead that we are requesting specifically. Do not skip the other factors checklist. For each of our competitions, there's something called an others factor checklist that's there in the guidelines, and it's there in this section of the guidelines. Do not skip it, because this is what I like to call a tiebreaker. If for some reason we get through awarding the funds that we plan to award for that type of grant and we have some extra funds, well, oftentimes what we'll have is a tier of applications that have the same score or a very similar total score. So how do we decide who among those applications gets the money that's left if there's not enough to fund all those applications? Well, that's where this other factors checklist comes in. The information about how your application is, these factors apply to your application it's part of the briefing for the decision official. And so it's important that you do identify that, because that might be that little bit of edge that could make your application successful. So do not skip that. Make sure that information is in there. All right. Andrew, you asked a question about if you submit a cleanup grant for multiple sites and your eligibility basis is different for the different sites, can that be managed in the threshold submittals? Yes. You're going to need to have a longer threshold submittal because you're going to need to address all the eligibility information for each of your sites in that section. Now, you want to identify those sites in the narrative and discuss them, but yes, that gets addressed in your threshold so that you can be more efficient in your narrative. When you're identifying a target area and priority or proposed sites, so a target area, remember, is the larger area in which it could be a neighborhood, it could be an industrial corridor, it could be some subset of your city that you are applying for, and that's where your sites are located. So this is where your disadvantaged communities are located, and so your sites are being selected within that area. That's going to be described in your narrative, and you're going to have briefly identified them in your narrative information sheet. But keep in mind that for each target area that is smaller than a city or town, you have to list the 11-digit census tract numbers within the target area. So you want to make sure that as you're identifying your target area or identifying all the census tracts within that, and that's going to be information that goes on I think that goes on the information sheet, the narrative information sheet. I don't believe you have to redo it in the application, but I could be wrong there. This is information that will help us identify how your application supports the President's Justice 40 initiative. So this is new this year that we're asking for this information. So if you've applied in the past, that's not something we've asked for in the past. So wanted to call your attention out that we need the census tract data. We also need to know the address of the priority or target sites that you are identified. So what your the brownfields that you are going to discuss in your narrative, we need to know the addresses for those. You are going to, and I've mentioned this already, you're going to discuss the target areas in the narrative, which is the meat of how you are describing your project to us. And in there, you're going to list the coalition members and each member's associated target area. Again, they cannot overlap. And a state or tribe who's providing for those larger grants is going to identify at least 3 target areas and 5 priority sites. And again, applicants other than tribes have to use that 11-digit census tract information and provide that as well as the address. It looks like it does have to be in the narrative. All right, I want to come back and talk about this letter from the state or tribes. For assessment grants, you need to have a current letter from your state or tribal environmental authority to specifically indicate they're aware of your project and they're aware of your plans to go forward, and in some cases, whether or not they're engaged in it. They do not need to provide, if you're applying as a state or tribe for any of these grant types, you do not need to provide a letter from yourself. But if you are any other type of applicant, you need to have one of these letters, and it must be dated currently for this competition. It does not count against any of the page limitations. It's not a substitute for any other information that we've asked about enforcement letters or anything like that. You can't use one you got from a previous year. You can use, if you're applying for multiple grants, you can have one letter that addresses all those, but each type must be listed in the letter, and you must attach the letter to your application. It gets attached to your narrative. And you cannot substitute a kind of letter from a more local or county level oversight authority. It has to be from the state level or the tribal level. If you are not sure who your state contact is for that, again, you can send us an email and we will get you that information. Okay, this is a really busy slide. And it's here largely for reference, but I did want to mention that a cleanup application has a different type of letter from your state environmental authority or tribal authority. This is a letter where they're going to talk about, they're going to tell us that they're aware of the cleanup you're planning and whether or not that project is eligible for their response program, voluntary state response program or voluntary tribal program. It must clearly indicate that it's for this year's application. So again, you can't use a previous one. And you're also going to, the state or tribe is going to also have to identify that it's in their opinion, you have sufficiently environmentally characterized the site, so you know enough about the contamination at the site that you will be able to move forward with the cleanup or the remediation work at the site. It either has to be done by now or it has to be done by June 15th. So we ask for a draft phase 2 as environmental site assessment, which is an ASTM phase 2 environmental site assessment, which involves sampling for contaminants on site. And then if it's draft, then by June 15th, we'll have to have confirmation from the state that you've done enough investigation for enrollment with them. If your site is not eligible for their site, you still need to get one of these letters that makes it clear from them that it's not eligible. And this must be attached to the application. Do not send it to us separately. Make sure you get it and it's dated prior to your submittal date. There is an optional template. So if you are one of our states and tribes on here, there is actually a template for these letters. And if you are applying for a cleanup grant, you might want to make sure your state has that template to make sure that the information is sufficient so that you'll be eligible for the grant. I mentioned we are going to publish your application after the competition is complete. Those are usually up until the next competition starts. So you need to clearly indicate if any information in your application you would like to be kept confidential and why you're claiming that it's confidential, privileged, or sensitive information. If you don't have any of that, still make sure you put on the information sheet that it's not applicable. So do address the question whether it's applicable or not. And if it is applicable, be sure to let us know what it is. Then we'll redact the information before we publish the applications online. I think I've said this, but I want to say it again. There's no page limit for threshold criteria and these and required associated attachments. And the type of threshold criteria are, and this is the pass-fail criteria, are different depending on the type of grant that is you're submitting for and the type of organization you are. So read through those carefully. I highly recommend you create an attachment to the narrative information sheet that goes 1, 2, 3 through each of the questions and explains it. If it's not applicable, put not applicable, but don't skip any so that we have complete information at the time we receive your application. We are not allowed to supplement any information that you provide us. So we need to make sure all the information there is available. But keep in mind that none of the attachments for threshold in the narrative information sheet are things that the reviewers are going to read and look at. So it is not scored, it's pass fail, and it doesn't go to the scoring review. All right, what do I mean by the scoring review? Well, part of the reason our application process takes so long has to do with the number of applications we receive, but we also have 3 stages. We have a threshold review, which is done by the home region, where we go through all the threshold criteria, then your responses to them, and determine whether you pass, whether you've met those criteria and can pass. If you do not, we'll notify you and give you a chance to dispute our findings. But if you do not pass threshold review, your application cannot go forward. What do I mean by going forward? An application that is successful in threshold goes through a ranking evaluation by a national panel and a ranking evaluation by a home panel. And these are done by different, for different criteria. There are 4 overarching criteria for the narrative that you're going to be writing. And 3 of those are reviewed by the national panel, and 1 is reviewed by the regional panel. The reason I'm bringing all this up is those scores are all added together and become your score, and all the scores are compiled, and that helps identify your rank in the competition process. So it's important to understand a little bit about your reviewers. So I like to think of this webinar as one where I'm trying to get you in the mind of your evaluators. The National Ranking Panel will include Brownfield staff from anywhere in the country, as well as staff from another EPA or federal organization. That's for the assessment grants. The national evaluators, actually anybody, if there might be a regional person on a national panel, they must stick within the 10 pages of response. They do not consider threshold or programmatic capability in the national review, because programmatic capability is that 4th criterion. They must evaluate the quality and extent and degree to which the narrative responds to the evaluation criteria. So there are 2 sections in your guidelines, and I'll call your attention more specifically to this later, but one section describes what we want you to write and what criteria you're addressing, and the other tells you how the reviewers are going to evaluate what you wrote. It's also important to note, except for in very limited circumstances, we cannot look at your web pages. We can't look you up in our ACRES system, the Brownfield's ACRES system. We can't go outside of the narrative. So don't bother to include references that are links. We can't look at them. And that just takes up some of your valuable space. So I wanted you to keep in mind that your evaluators, those that are scoring your application, are from anywhere in the country. We have 10 regional offices and we have a few field offices. So the Brownfield staff that are there are from anywhere in the country, which means that they're unlikely to be familiar with your political situation, your geographic situation, and your state's or tribe's environmental voluntary cleanup program. So it's important to keep in mind that you're providing the information that is necessary for a reviewer, just think of an average person, to read it and score your application. These are not all from the same background. We at EPA have a very diverse set of backgrounds, from scientists and engineers to communication specialists to grant specialists. So I can't even tell you that this is all going to be reviewed by engineers and geologists and environmental professionals. That's not the way it works. Well, they're environmental professionals, but they may not have a specialty in the sciences or in the type of contaminants that you are trying to address. And the programmatic and brownfield team member is a little different. So for assessment grants, we have 3 reviews per application. So there's going to be 3 evaluators assigned to your application. They're only going to review the narrative. Reviewers take anywhere from 2 to 8 hours per application. It can vary. And we never know how many applications we're going to expect each reviewer to look at. Why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because I want you to keep in mind that some reviewers will go through your application very quickly, and you need to make sure that the information is obvious to them that they need to apply a score to. Some reviewers will take more time and get more into the nitty-gritty, which means they're going to be looking for more specific information and details than other reviewers might, even though we're all reviewing the same thing and using all the same criteria. It depends on how much time is available to that reviewer often. And we really never know how many applications we're each going to review. So the reason I bring that up is because there's something called reviewer fatigue. So when I review applications, I try to read through them all first before I go through and score any. We're not comparing applications, but that resets my mind each year. But depending on whether you are the first application someone reads or the later application somebody reads, you want to make sure you're kind to your reviewer. And what I mean by that is don't stretch the font and space requirements of the application guidelines, because if you more dense you put the information on the page, the harder it is for reviewers going through many of these to suss out the information that you've provided. So follow the guidelines with respect to the font size and the spacing in the margins, please. I think that's another duplicate. I thought I'd gone through and gotten all those. Are there any questions I have not addressed? I think I got Andrew's. I don't see any in the chat. Is there anybody who has anything they want to ask about that before we get into the nitty-gritty of the evaluation criteria? Hearing and seeing none, I'm going to move forward. This is the meat of today's presentation. It's the proposal evaluation criteria. Now, I'm being very specific in the wording I'm using. There's a narrative, which is a narrative, and then I just forgot it. There's 2 different sections in your guidelines. We'll highlight the 2 different sections because I want to make sure you are looking at the evaluation criteria as you are preparing the narrative, because that's how we're going to score your application. So let's move on. What makes a good, strong application, a highly competitive application? That you understand your brownfields challenges, they're well defined, that you've considered what it's going to take those properties that are in your underserved communities and get them all the way to a beneficial reuse to your community, that you have local community support. Those who are impacted most by your brownfield sites are engaged and their interests are being addressed. And you have clear objectives for what you're going to do with the grant and what you expect the grant to achieve. So this is pretty basic. You're going to tell us a story that's going to walk through these things in our criteria. There's some general tips here. Some of this should be fairly obvious, but I will mention again, read the guidelines. Read the entire guidelines. Remember that the reviewer knows nothing about your community. Avoid using acronyms, even though we do, and I provided that alphabet soup of acronyms. Avoid using acronyms and technical jargon that may not be familiar to the types of reviewers that I identified for you. Respond to all the criteria. If one of the criteria, whether it's threshold or narrative, isn't applicable, don't skip it. I highly recommend that you not blend the criteria, but that you provide a very specific response to each criterion and subcriterion. If it's somewhere else in the application or you've blended them and a reviewer has to dig for the information, it's likely to impact your score negatively. Number your pages because that helps in your PDF for us to review them. And it helps to enumerate and identify the criteria you're responding to. You do not have to repeat everything about the criterion. We know space is important, but we have numbered criterion. And if you want to include the number, that would be fine. If you want to include a abbreviation of what the criterion is, that is fine. But be sure you address each of the criterion specifically. The reviewers are looking at the quality of your response. So they're looking to make sure you're not just repeating the concept that we've asked you to address, but that you are actually providing specifics about your situation that address those concepts and how they fit with that. Be sure to organize your submittal so your threshold criteria are clear as an attachment and any documentation of eligibility, which is an attachment to the threshold criteria, is clear and it's easy for people to go through. I actually recommend, if you have the capacity, it's not a requirement, you go through and include bookmarks in your, and make sure your PDF is renderable so people can search for key words. There is an application. You do not, checklist in your guidelines, do not submit that with your application. It's there to help you make sure it's complete. And here's that last one I was talking about. Don't fatigue your reviewers. Use the requirements, the 1-inch margins and the 12-point fonts. I'm going to take a brief moment to address Dawn's question. Dawn is asking if a draft APCA is to be included on the cleanup grant, but you don't want to attach assessments, even if the assessments are listed attachments of the APCA. That is correct. Do not attach your phase 1 and phase 2 reports. We're looking for a draft APCA to show that you understand the requirements of an APCA, and that is a threshold criterion and would not be looked at by the reviewers at all. So there's no reason to make your submission that lengthy by including those assessment reports. So leave off the APCA attachments that are made up of those kind of things, like a phase 1 or phase 2. All right. Narrative ranking criteria. That was the word I was looking for. In section 4E of the guidelines, and again, you want to read the guidelines all the way through, there is a section called narrative ranking criteria. This is the information that you are asked to write and tell us about. And there are several sub-criterion for each of these major criterion. There is a total number of points for each criterion, and that can differ by types. Just want to point out for the community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, the weighting of the community need and community engagement changed this year. The sub-criteria language is similar across the different types of grants, but it may differ, so be sure you're reading the correct guidelines. And I've already mentioned this, but highly suggest you number the criterion and the sub-criterion where you're specifically responding to it, because if a reviewer has to look elsewhere in your application for the information, there is a indication that it will probably get a lower score. So those were the assessment. I'll just go back for a second. Those are the assessment totals, 160, 165, and 160. And remember, these top 3 criterion are reviewed by the national panel, and this last criterion is reviewed by the regional panel. For cleanup, the total number of points available are 180. And again, we're going through a similar panel process. I should mention that for cleanup grants, there are 2 only 2 reviewers, and they're both brownfields experts, if you will. We put brownfield staff on the cleanup grants. So the first 3 criterion, project area description and plans for revitalization, community need and community engagement, the task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress are reviewed by a national panel of 2. The programmatic capability and past performance is reviewed by the home region. So if you're applying for a project in Region 7, that would be the Region 7 Brownfields team. So I'm going to go back and stress once more time that you want to look in both these sections. As you are writing responses to the criteria in 4E, you want to make sure you're simultaneously looking at the criterion that are set out, the evaluation criteria in 5A, which is going to tell you how many points you're going to get for each aspect of the criterion. I will mention later, if you use the Tab Easy tool, they've laid those out right next to each other for you to help with the writing of the application. But if you don't have, if you're not using that tool, be sure to consider the information in both sections. All right, we're just going to talk briefly about each of these criterion. The project area description and plans for revitalization. This is going to set the stage for the rest of your application. This is where you're going to tell us what your brownfield situation is, how it has impacted your community, and it's going to tell us a little bit about how you're planning to get the resources to take you from A to Z on revitalizing your site. It's where you're going to help demonstrate, you're going to be telling us what your long-term outcomes are you're planning for your grant. This is one of the places that will be identified. So what do you think this grant will help you achieve will be part of this section. I put in the box here to consider the aspects that are described in section 1 of the guidelines. A lot of people skip reading section 1 because you're responding to 2 other sections. But there's some useful information here that EPA has put in about what we mean by environmental justice, what we mean about supporting climate adaptation and resilience, what we mean by supporting high quality jobs and strong labor practices and equitable workforce pathways. This is a hint. There are criteria where you're going to need to understand this and address the things we've said there. So there's more criteria in there. They're not criterion. There's more information in that section. But at different places in your application, you may want to emphasize how your project is related to some of these things, including renewable energy or energy efficient approaches to brownfields redevelopment. So if you're going to use a greener cleanup approach, be sure to identify that. If the reuse of the site is going to be something that is energy related or that is going to be clearly adaptive to climate change and resilient as climate changes, those are things you're going to want to make sure you highlight, even though that might not be clearly specific in the guidelines. What makes a strong proposal in this section, that you have described your community's brownfields challenges, you've defined your target areas clearly, and remember, for coalition agreements, that means a target area for each coalition member, and that is that do not overlap. And that as you move forward through the different sections of the proposal, it's clear that what you're talking about is related to these challenges and targets and what your expected outcomes are for this grant. You're going to thoroughly describe the priority brownfield or cleanup sites. Want to make sure that you demonstrate as detailed understanding of the purpose of an assessment or the cleanup grant. So this is where I'm talking about both, we're going to clean up the site, but what will that lead to? We're going to clean up the site so that it's available for a future use, or we're going to clean up the site and we're going to conduct a market study to determine what is the best use for that property. So there's just a way you're going to describe in here why you chose those sites and what you expect to achieve with the grant for those sites. You're going to provide specific details about how your project that you are proposing in your application relates to current local government land use plans, so you can demonstrate alignment. So you can show that you are in alignment and you are moving forward some of the community-wide goals that have been set by your government. In the assessment guidelines, we explicitly ask you to include underserved and or disadvantaged communities in your prioritization criteria. And here's where I wanted to bring up when we talk about underserved or disadvantaged communities, or there's another term for it. We are asking you to look in the CJUST tool, which is the mapping tool, screening tool that is put forward as part of the Justice 40 initiative and it's the Community Justice and Environmental. I thought I should write this down and I apparently did not. But CJUST is the tool you want to use to identify that, and you want to identify that you identified it in CJUST. So if we specifically say, as identified in CJUST, be sure you identify it from CJUST and you indicate you identified it in that program. So we have another tool, our environmental justice tool, and there are aspects of the application where that is the information you'll want to present. But the CJUST tool goes much down to it goes down to the census tract level, and is the tool we want you to use again for identifying those census tracts and making sure you're identifying underserved or disadvantaged communities that you will be positively impacting. And this section will clearly connect to what you're going to describe as the activities you're going to undertake, that you are, and you've clearly described. So if you have a target area that is an industrial corridor, what is the current state of the infrastructure for there? Is there going to need to be updates to the sewer and water? Is there are you going to require the developer to do that? Are there going to need to be new roads put in, new transit bus stations to bring people into your redevelopment? So that's what we mean when we're talking about what is the current infrastructure. We also talk about what is the needed infrastructure, what will need to accompany the revitalization of your site. So do pay attention to that. One helpful thing is to actually use a little quote or an excerpt from the local land use plans as you're describing that, to clearly show in words that they link. That's one way to do it. There's other ways to do it as well. There's a section where we ask you to identify resources that you're going to apply for, or in the case of cleanup, that you've already applied for and are leveraging. One way to identify that is to talk about what the eligibility criteria are for those different resources and how you as an applicant are eligible for that. So what do I mean by this? Our funding, whether it's assessment or cleanup, is just one step in the process of revitalizing your site. How are you going to find the resources to do the rest of the work? And we want you to identify that you have some idea of how you're going to carry the project forward to completion. And that's where sometimes you may not have secured any, you may not have applied for any funds yet, but if you talk about the types of funding that might be available and how it would apply and how you're eligible, that is one successful way to address this. Next slide. All right. I was already getting into this. You wanted to demonstrate how funds that, and these don't have to be federal funds, they can be local, they can be nonprofit, they can be private developer funds, and how those will be leveraged. And in the case of cleanup, have any of them been specifically secured, and how those funds will take the project to another step or complete a step in the whole revitalization process. And you can also demonstrate, for assessment at least, that the funds can be or will be sought for all the grants. You want to make sure that you demonstrate you have the funding for everything that needs to be done. or that you know where you might seek the funding for everything needs to be done. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have activities that, if, for example, if you're applying for a cleanup grant and you're applying for 500,000, but it's going to cost 600,000, where are you going to get the other 100,000? And then where are you going to get the funds to actually do the redevelopment activities and the improvement activities? Is that going to be a developer? Is that going to be additional resources you get from the state to, how is it going to be DOT money you're going to be using to improve the infrastructure? So just think of it holistically and summarize that in your response to the criterion. One tricky thing here is we talk about leverage resources, and then later we talk about your budget. And a lot of applicants will choose to only include a portion of their salary and personnel costs, for example. And the rest of it will be it will be resources that they're providing, sort of as their skin in the game, if you will. That, if you include that here, you cannot include it in the budget place. But if you include something here, like additional funds for cleanup, you don't want to address them again in the other section. You do not want to duplicate this information. And the cleanup grants applications require that you include secured funding that is significant, relevant, and sufficient to complete the cleanup. So that's the only way you can get full points for that criterion. You still could get more, you could still get ranked or scored pretty highly, but you cannot get all the points available if you don't have any secured resources, and that's demonstrated in your attachments.
Susan, we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
Let's see. Andrew's. I think we got
Must be
that, and then Dawn's. If the project is being done in phases and the community received a loan to a portion of the remediation on the site, how should that be documented in the leverage section?
I think that you would include the commitment letter. You just need to include something that demonstrates that the amount of the loan, and you need to be cautious to make sure then when you're talking about the budget for the cleanup, that you don't mention the dollar amount again. You just mentioned that those, that you have all the resources to complete a cleanup. And again, that gets kind of tricky between those two sections. And Andrew, I see your question about addresses for each property for a cleanup site, or can you list the addresses in the narrative information sheet? You cannot reference anything in the narrative information sheet. But if you have multiple parcels, whether you have to identify each of those parcels, I don't know. So if you will send that question to Tara, we will get an answer to that. So if you have numerous sites or numerous properties that are going to be part of your brownfield site that you're cleaning up, we'll figure out if there's a summary shorthand you can use in your application for that. All right. Moving on to community need and an overview. Community need and engagement. If you're familiar with EPA, you should know that engagement with your community and those most impacted by contaminated sites is one of our core values. So you're going to need to describe in this section that your work is going to meet the needs of a specific community, and that your work is necessary because that portion of your community couldn't get this work done otherwise. You're going to address whether the work is going to help a population that has a high incidence of some specific adverse health conditions, and greater than normal incidences of disease in the target area. And you're going to discuss how it will advance environmental justice. So again, I want to make sure you've read that first section about what environmental justice means to us. You're looking for where we are asking you specifically to provide information from CJust, But I will tell you there's a environmental justice screening tool that is available to everyone, that you can plug your census tracts and information into, and it will give you some of the information that might be useful for your response area. You're not required to use it, but it might be useful. Now this year, so that's the first section in community engagement. It's what is the community situation that you're going to meet the needs of? What is the specific health issues? What are the specific environmental justice? How are they disadvantaged or have been disproportionately represented over years? That's the information you're going to provide in that section. The next section, you're going to tell us who your partners are. And then I don't mean in a coalition, your coalition members necessarily, although you can include them. But I'm talking about the other partners you're going to need to engage in the process to make sure the work can get done. Often these are community organizations that represent part of the disadvantaged community, or it can be a neighborhood organization or whomever. But you're going to want to explain the role of that organization in your project, how they're going to be involved. And this year we're asking you to provide the mission of that community group so that it's clear that the work you're planning and that they're going to be working with you on aligns with their mission. And then there's a section where we're asking you about your plan for communicating your project progress, and including that it's based on public input as you go. So it's important you outline your plan there. And if you're successful, that's going to translate over into a plan you will implement under your grant. As I mentioned, this year we're asking for the entity's mission. This is a suggested format for completing the project involvement and roles section. And we want to make sure you consider as diverse a group as would be helpful in implementing your project, and that you have an involvement of different types of partners, and that those partners are relevant to where you're going with this project. I want to emphasize, do not include any letters of support. Don't include a congressional letter of support. Don't include a letter of support from each of these organizations, which is something we used to require in the past. They won't be read and they'll be removed from the application. So it is important to include what might have been included in a support letter, like what the mission is and how they'd be involved in the project, but don't include any specific letter from the organization that describes it. I've already mentioned it's a key value for EPA that you engage the community, that you are discussing your project throughout, and that if you have an area that doesn't have a population, who's most impacted by that area? So who is the disadvantaged community you're serving? Will it be the community that'll end up with jobs there? Is it the community in the neighborhoods that are adjacent to? Who's impacted by the site that you're addressing? How are you going to communicate to these groups? How frequently are you going to communicate with them? How are you going to make sure that you are communicating with them in a way that is accessible to that community? So are you only relying on city council meetings? Are those city council meetings at a time when that community and the types of jobs they have will allow them to attend? If you're only looking at doing this online, does your whole community have access to the ability to get online? So think about how the community is best served and communicated with. Also consider how and when you're going to solicit input and provide a response. You are required to do that a little bit before the application is submitted, but when you finalize your draft analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives for a cleanup grant, there's a required community engagement process that's associated with that. And are you going to do that? That's the minimum, or are you going to do more? We also ask you to address how you will, if we run into another COVID situation, let's hope we don't, but how you would address socially distanced engagement ideas. And even before COVID, we had situations where people might not be able to attend something in person for a variety of reasons, one being their immunization system is depressed. So how would they access information and have an opportunity to comment? Think that through, be clear and concise. The third criterion is the meat of what you are actually going to use the funding to do. This is where you're going to tell us what tasks and activities you're going to do, who's going to be involved in conducting those activities, and who's the lead in implementing and overseeing those activities. How you're budgeting your funds is going to demonstrate how much you know about what these things might cost and how you came up with those numbers. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean about that in later slides. You're also going to talk about how you are going to determine, as you're moving forward, that you're on schedule and you're tracking and measuring your project, and that you know when you've accomplished your goals. So the goals within the grant period, and then those that might occur, your broader outcomes. So what we're looking for here is not your list of goals and activities and outcomes, because that information should be provided earlier in the application. But we're looking here to identify the process by which you're going to know you have achieved, and the tools you're going to use to make sure you stay on target and on budget and get to the end result. Andrew asks a valuable question about, he indicates that often a local government will engage with a community on a project in contexts other than brownfields, such as planning, entitlements, housing, neighborhoods, etc. Does that engagement count towards this criterion? Yes, if you can link it. If you can link those meetings, that information that has come from the community to the work you're going to do, you certainly can include it as part of your engagement. There is some specific engagement that is required for our grants, but the broader engagement certainly can be considered and identified. All right. The tasks, costs, and measuring projects description and task activities. That's the third criterion we're already talking about. We have provided a couple sample formats for the different aspects of the subcriterion. We've asked for information on your project implementation, those activities that are going to be funded with EPA's the grant money, and the non-grant resources you're going to need to carry that out if applicable. So here's where that RLF loan might need to be mentioned, and you have to decide whether you want to count it as leveraging or if you want to include it here in that it's necessary to get the cleanup done. You're going to include some information on your anticipated project schedule. Remember, you have a specific number of years. We've identified that you need to make certain aspects of sufficient progress within 18 months or 30 months. How are you going to lay out your work to demonstrate that you're going to get that work done in a timely manner? We ask for, a broad task such as phase 1 environmental investigations. And if that is your task, then we want to know what activities are included under that task. Do you need to get you do need to get your site confirmed as being eligible. Do you need to have a quality environmental professional doing something? Do you have to, at that point, for each of the tasks and in the box here in the examples are things that might fall under those tasks. Submitting quality assurance project plan, conducting the actual work of a phase 1 or phase 2 environmental site assessment or a hazardous substance survey, being enrolled in a cleanup a cleanup program, and then certifying at the end of the day that a cleanup is complete if you have a cleanup grant. If you have a requirement that you are doing there's a local government may use up to 10% of their total grant award for monitoring health. If you are doing that, you need to identify the tasks and activities specific to that, and if you are coordinating with a local health agency. There's no cost share required this year, so just another emphasis on that. And all grant types may use up to 5% of your funds for administrative costs. Your costs may not exceed this. So if you are putting together a budget and your organization wants you to apply your indirect rate, say, you can apply up to 5% of your indirect rate. So if your indirect rate is 10%, you can only get 5% of that back, and you want to make sure you identify that in your budget. There's also something called direct administrative costs, and these get a little tricky because you're separating them from programmatic costs. For those of you who don't know the history of this program, we had a time when we could not charge any administrative costs to the grant. And so at that time, we identified what was considered a programmatic cost, the cost of implementing the grant, and what was an administrative cost, which might be the costs of complying with the grant regulations. So it's a subtle distinction, but if you want to include direct administrative costs, you need to be very aware of that. Otherwise, it's usually just the indirect rate that an agency is trying to apply, or an organization. And I should mention that we are going to be under a revised set of grant regulations after October 1st. Well, we are now. So these grants will be implemented under the new grant regulations, which includes a change in the de minimis indirect rate. So make sure you're aware of that. But again, you can only get up to 5% of it anyway. There's a couple of things that are called out in your project implementation. First of all, I'm going to suggest you group your activities into logical subsets of the work, even if it's cleanup. You know, you want to have more than one task. You want to have more than just a cleanup task. So a community engagement task, a project implementation management task, that's going to talk about the reporting and meeting with your contractors and doing the contracting, because those are all eligible programmatic costs. If you're planning to issue a subaward for any reason, whether it's for help with community engagement, or you're passing through your work to an organization that's going to help you with managing your grant, you need to indicate what those tasks or activities or services will be subgranted. And if you've already identified that subgrantee or subawardee, you're going to have to include information in threshold on that. So I want to call your attention to that. Participant support costs are the costs that you might provide to, for example, a member of a community organization that's going to work closely with you. That can be a stipend to cover their time and allowable costs. That's a different type of cost. So if you're going to do a subaward, or if you're going to pay a community member to be engaged with you, then that is a participant support cost. Two different types of costs that fall in the other budget object class category. And again, if you're going to identify other resources, other funds, or resources that are necessary, this is the place you want to mention them, not in the budget. So you have covered it in the leveraging section. You want to be careful about how you cover it in the budget section. I have in this red box, there's several things that will not allow you to score highly or at the highest level. And that includes including activities that are ineligible. So if you're not sure if something you're planning to do is eligible, that is a question you can ask us. If the grant funds are used to support more than one community liaison per target area. So we're encouraging you to have community liaisons, because that's a really effective way to get community input. But we are suggesting that you only have one in each of your target areas. And for the coalitions, assessment coalitions, and the community-wide grants for states and tribes, you need to clearly, if you are subawarding key aspects of your programmatic, administrative, and financial requirements of the grant, you are not likely to get full points. So that's something to think about. If your organization does not have the capacity as the coalition lead to conduct all of the required activities, whether that's contracting, whether that's drawing of funds and submitting your, dispersing funds, managing the contractor, overseeing the specific work, and leading the community engagement. Those things that's going to detract from your score. So I just want to put that out there because those are key things that will prevent you from receiving full points. This is a highly competitive competition, and you really need to maximize your ability to earn points. I mentioned earlier that and I'll come up on my next slide, I'll be talking about measuring project progress, but what do we mean by that? In that earlier section in the guidelines, and this is now 1D, you're going to read about the outputs and outcomes that EPA expects your grant to have. At minimum, somewhere in your application, you're going to be addressing this. So your outputs for your activities are going to be addressed in your discussion of your activities. So if you are going to produce a phase 1 or a phase 2, how many of those do you think you're going to get done? If you're going to do a quality assurance project plan, you need to include that as an output. So outputs are the things that you can quantify. Sometimes they're qualitative, but they're usually measurable milestones, products of your project. An outcome is the broader result, effect, or consequence that will occur from implementing the grant. Now, this could be something that is after the grant's been implemented, or it could be something that occurs while you're implementing the grant. So as you're working with your community groups and you're helping them become more informed about the environment or about impacts on their health, and that would allow them to maybe make healthier choices, those things would be considered outcomes. If they're going to be able to get more sustainable job by the kind of reuse you're going to be having, that would be an outcome. They're not necessarily achievable during the project period. And I mentioned early on, the places to sort of address these outcomes are in section 1, as you're talking about what is the problems you're addressing in the community. You're also going to talk about what your desired outcome is. And also when you're talking about the impacts on health and environmental justice, there's another place where you can identify desired outcomes, what positive impacts this work would have on those situations. Now, we'd expect you to be able to say your community has a higher than average rate of asthma, and this cleanup of this site is going to, have a huge effect on that. But if you can link that the site that you're addressing is a source of contaminants that might be affecting or increasing the asthma rates, you're going to want to identify that you are, one of your outcomes will be to reduce the potential contaminants that contribute to that high rate. So again, there's a difference between outputs and outcomes. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to talk about your cost estimates, because this is a place that it is easy to lose. I shouldn't say lose, because you earn points, to not earn your full points. In your budget, you're only going to address the grant funds. So if you're applying for a 1.2 million community-wide state and tribal grant, then you're only going to address that 1.2 million in your budget table and in your budget information. So no leverage resources here, no loans that have been made elsewhere. For those of you who have been engaged in the program as long as I have, we used to require you to distinguish between hazardous substances as a site and petroleum as a site. That is no longer required in the budget. One budget combined for the types of sites you're addressing. You do need to describe how the cost estimates for each task were developed. So you're going to describe your tasks and activities for us already, and then your budget needs to correlate with that. And where possible, you want to present per unit cost. So if you are presenting a number for personnel, a dollar amount for personnel, well, how did you derive that number? How many hours of that is that? What type of salary level, and why are you estimating those number of hours? If you're talking about contracting hours, contracting hours or flat rates for certain activities, you need to include those unit costs and describe how, oops, that should be taken off there. There is no cost share so this is not there anymore. Scratch that out. There is a guidance, and it's called the Interim General Budget Development Guidance for applicants and recipients that is available to all EPA grantees that talks a lot about the different types of costs. So that might be something, if you're not sure how you would go about driving some of these costs or what kind of information you would need to provide, that's one place you can look. So in the guidelines, and we're talking about section 5 now, remember I'm talking about the section that talks about how you will be scored or evaluated. In that section, there are some specific things. Look for italics and look for the words scored more favorably or less favorably, or cannot receive full points. You're going to go through and highlight all of that in your guidelines. Those are things you want to make sure you are addressing if it's applicable to your project. So if you have a community-wide assessment grant, at least 40% of those funds, if allocated to the site-specific activities, the investigation work, the cleanup planning, then you will have a higher score. If you are a coalition or a state and tribal community-wide grant, then you have to have at least 60% of your funds programmed for site-specific activities if you want to receive full points. So just keep that in mind. If you exceed the 5%, so for example, if you indicate you're going to use the de minimis indirect rate, and that's higher than 5%, so you include 10%, that will get you will not score as well. But if you say 5% up to 5% of our 10% de minimis rate, and then you include that dollar figure, that would make sense, and that will not impact your score negatively. And we also expect you to identify that your costs are reasonable or realistic. Now, this is where it's important to remember that your reviewers are coming from all over the country, and the costs of these activities are different all over the country. So if you know you are in a rural, somewhat isolated community, and you know it's harder to get an environmental contractor out there, so you might need to pay more for one, that's something you're going to want to identify, that was an impact in your costs that you developed. Or if, I'll stop at that example. Andrew, I'll come back to your question when we're done through here. So what do I mean about providing unit costs? These are just some examples. They don't add up to a budget, but what we're asking for is this level of detail. If you're estimating that your personal and program management costs for your project that your planner that's going to be working on it is going to have 480 hours, which is across, remember, the number of years of the performance period. So that'd be 120 hours per year. How did you come up with that number? What's the estimate for how much investment there will be in each of the activities under the task? If you're providing travel, we do highly encourage you to plan to attend at least one National Brownfields Conference, because that can be paid for directly from the grant. And in that instance, you would include a budget for what that would cost. The cost of registration for a conference goes in a different section of your budget. It goes under other costs, just so you know. I'm not going to go through all these details anymore, but I wanted to point out the level of detail. These slides will be available to you, and you can look at that. We do provide a example budget table, a recommended budget table, which you're not required to use, but what you are required to do is to give us your costs by budget object class or budget category, and these are the specific budget categories, and by the major tasks. So depending on how you're laying things out, this is how you would want to identify it. So, and that should all add up to your total. Now, we do not evaluate your budget table. We evaluate your budget description. But it's important that this table match what's in your 424A, which is the budget table for your application, the official form, and that you are describing each of these costs and that the total you've put here adds up to the total you have for your cost description. If you are applying for a cleanup grant and more than 50% of your contractor costs are going to be for that cleanup, then it becomes a construction cost. This is something that was new, and we do have I don't think I have a link for it here, but we do have a 1-page, a 2-page budget and contracting page to help with understanding this. But your contractual costs would be your quality environmental professional who might be helping you oversee the work, or it could be attorney if you're having to get some legal assistance. Your construction costs in a cleanup grant will be the costs of your remediation contractor, the costs for those that are you've hired to actually implement the cleanup. If you don't know exactly what those costs are, you're going to put that down under other. So that will be like if you're going to do multiple sites and you've estimated a certain amount for that, and it's really pretty much an estimate, then you're going to put that down in a different section. So these are just example of how to use the chart. If you choose not to use this, just be sure it's clear that you're using all of these budget object class categories that are applicable and that you are describing the costs per task. Here, this slide goes a little bit more into detail about what is contractual and what is construction. There is a couple pieces of guidance out there to help with this. Like I said, there's a document EPA has published, the program is published, and there's these frequently asked questions. That is another document that I would direct you to, is the frequently asked questions for the fiscal year 25 competition. There's a lot of information in there that might answer your questions when it comes to trying to figure this stuff out. So keep that in mind. All right, I've completed the 3 criterion that are going to be reviewed by the national panel. The 4th criterion, which is programmatic capability and past performance, is going to be reviewed by your home region. And in this section, you're asked to tell us how you're going to, that your organization has the capacity to oversee grant tasks and carry out and manage all the work of the grant. If, as I mentioned before, if you are a state or tribal entity applying for a community-wide state or tribal grant, or if you are a coalition entity applying for a coalition grant, it's important both in your budget and here that you make it clear, and in your task lead, you make it clear that your organization has the capacity to do this work. You're not passing it through to somebody. If you are an assessment applicant and you do routinely pass through funds to another organization to provide certain services, you will need to demonstrate that you understand it. You are the entity who works with EPA, so your entity is the one that has to have the draw funds with EPA, report to EPA, all of those things, even if you're getting support from another organization. You want to tell us that you understand the roles you'll need to have on your team and how you're going to be making decisions for a coalition. That's something that you'll outline in your memorandum of agreement. And internally and externally, what does your team look like as far as you having a qualified environmental professional? Is that somebody you have on staff, or is that somebody you're going to hire? Who's going to be the project manager? Who is going to be taking care of financial information? Who's going to review invoices? Even though some of those things are administrative tasks, it's important to represent that you have a team that can do all that work. So part of that is telling us who your key staff are, or at least their roles of the key staff, and how you would acquire, that you have the capacity to acquire additional resources. Often we're really referring to contractor support here. But it also can be that pass-through support to another organization that routinely assists your type of organization with grants management activities. We also ask for you to describe how your efforts to get additional resources will promote strong labor practices, local hiring, or link members of the community to potential employment opportunities. Now, this year, under the new grant guidelines, there's no longer a prohibition from using geographic area as one of your criterion for selecting a contract. So you can identify local hire or give preference to local hiring in a way we've never been able to allow you to do before. So keep that in mind. There's information about that on the new grant requirements. I think EPA might even have a webinar up there nationally about that. So keep that in mind. So once you've addressed that, there's the last section. And here you're going to talk to us about how you can demonstrate to us that you've done something similar in the past, that you've successfully implemented a grant in the past. So if you had EPA funds, there's a set of questions you're going to answer. If you've not received an EPA grant, but you've had another similar grant from another agency or another grant of the same size and scale, or just plain another grant, you're going to describe certain activities. And if you're a brand new organization, nonprofit, and you've never had any federal or non-federal assistance agreements, you have to indicate that, and you don't have to answer these questions, but you'll get a specific score as described in the guidelines. Do not skip any of this. So you will identify which category you fall under, and then you will answer the questions directly related to your category. And they are related to demonstrating your ability to manage all aspects of your grant, any reporting requirements. Be sure if you're reporting about a program that was not a Brownfield grant, that you include some of what was required. What reporting did you have to do? What did you have to do to demonstrate success? How was success defined? What steps did a great answer will explain that you complied with the work plan, schedule, and award conditions and provide some specifics. A good answer will say we complied with all work plan, schedule, and award conditions and describe a little bit about the accomplishments. So what I'm trying to say here is the level of detail you can provide. And I know you're at the end of your page limits, but the level of detail you comply here may increase your score. I think that's all I can say on that. So I think there's some questions I haven't addressed. I think we are down to Andrew's. I am often confused on a section by section basis about the project we are asked to respond on. For example, is it the cleanup or the redevelopment or both? How do we decide when the criterion is not specific? What is the expectation or default meaning of project? That is an excellent question. And I think you have to take it from the context of the criteria. But I'm going to make a note of that question so that we try to be clearer in future guidelines when we're asking for site-specific information or about the work you're conducting versus the broader goals or the broader project, which could be the revitalization of your target area. When we're in the section 3 and we're talking about the grant funds, that's where you're talking specifically about how you're using the grants funds and the activities you're going to conduct with funding. That should be pretty clearly in a cleanup grant directly related to the site. Elsewhere, when we're talking about, for example, describing how your project, there's the word, aligns with the community priorities in a community planning grant, then we're talking about your broader revitalization project. What you would always probably want to say, the cleanup and revitalization of this site aligns because X, Y, and Z. So it is definitely context related, and I apologize, it is less than clear, and we will try to clarify that in future. I will try to get that clarified in future guidelines. Andrew, did you want to ask any more on that?
No, that's great. I thanks for acknowledging that, and hopefully that helps others too.
Yeah, I agree. And the other thing I haven't said, and I will say, when you read section 5, which is the evaluation criteria, I recommend going through and underlining ands and ors and ors. So it's clear to you when you need to provide two pieces of information because it's an and, or when you need to provide only one piece because it's an and or an or is the modifier. You really need to parse that all out because it gets very confusing very fast. And that actually applies to both the narrative and the evaluation criteria, but it is important to understand how you're going to be scored. And so if it's an and or, and you provide both pieces of information, you won't get scored less, but it may not have been necessary to use your space for that. So you will need to make some judgment calls on that. All right, we are wrapping up now. I have no idea where we're at time because I just tend to just go. Just a few things. A reminder that we will be having a specific session like this about RLF. We will be going a little bit more into the RLF requirements because they are much more complex cooperative agreements, and they require therefore, they require a longer term commitment to capitalizing a loan program for brownfields cleanup. So that is what we're going to be covering on the 9th. And then we will have one more session. So if there's any last minute questions you have or clarifications you need, you can send them to us and we will get them answered, but we'll also cover them in the last session that we'll hold on the 15th. All right. As I mentioned, there's a lot of resources available to you, and it is shocking to me sometimes what applicants who don't take advantage of some of these things. So we provided a lot of links already to the Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization website and the competition resources they have up there. I mentioned the summary of the frequently asked questions. Those are divided up by grant type and topic, and they're easy to go through. There's also a summary of the Brownfields guideline changes. So if you've applied in the past or last year and were unsuccessful or successful, you need to look and see if you're applying again, what has changed. And they're pretty clearly outlined in that document. We also covered a lot of that in the webinar last week or this week. Whenever I had the first webinar, I've lost track. I want to mention the Kansas State University TAB program, Technical Assistance to Brownfields, for a variety of reasons. One is they have created a Tab Easy tool, which is available to everybody nationally. It provides a platform in which you can draft your different sections of your application, and it will help you identify that any areas you might miss. As I mentioned earlier, it will have the criterion, the narrative, ranking criterion and the evaluation criterion side by side. So you can make sure that you're writing your narrative to speak to the evaluation criterion. And it's just a good tool for helping you get that all together. Also, your state organization, environmental authority, your brownfields program with your state or voluntary cleanup program with your state, and K-State will review draft applications. But it's important you reach out to them now so that you can they can let you know when they would need to receive it by before they can give you comments. I highly recommend having it reviewed by one of these organizations. It has made an impact on who's successful or not because they're experienced with the different types of grants and with, like, K-State has been reviewing grant applications for several years. So reach out to them and it's a valuable resource. If you do not have time or you did not get to TAB or to the state to review your application, please make sure you have someone, probably somebody who's not necessarily part of your program, read your application through before it's submitted to make sure you haven't skipped anything and that it's clearly understandable. So somebody who doesn't know anything about your area might be able to pick it up and read it. So I know that's a big ask, but I highly recommend it that you have another read through. So thanks for joining us today. We are recording this year's this webinar. It'll have all my ums and ahs, but it will be available on our website. The earlier recording is already posted. And again, go up to the national website to look for those other recordings. Tara Vaughn, who was assisting me today, is our Region 7 Brownfields competition lead this year. So if you have specific questions, please direct them to her. CC the R7 underscore brownfields at EPA.gov. I should write that out because you can't really see the underscore. R7 underscore brownfields at EPA.gov box. Because if she's out of the office, we can monitor that and maybe get to questions that she might not get to. And don't forget, if you have questions about whether you're meeting the threshold requirements or what you need to do to demonstrate that, you can reach out to us on that at any time. We cannot discuss how to address any more specifically than I did here today, the ranking and evaluation criteria. I will look to make sure we've addressed all the questions here in a moment. But I'm going to go right to the last slide to let you know, I mentioned in this that we do encourage you to attend a National Brownfields Conference. The next one that is coming up is in Chicago in August. Now, that is before your grant, if you're successful, would likely be awarded, but there is an opportunity to be reimbursed for those costs if you get the grant. So by that time, you'll know whether you're getting a grant or not, and you can choose whether you want to attend this conference that's coming up. These national conferences are great networking opportunities. It's great to get insight into other things and approaches that you haven't necessarily considered. And there's a chance to meet with developers. It's a very useful conference to attend, especially if you are newer to working with brownfields. So are there any questions left? I want to thank you all again for participating with us today. I hope this is helpful. I hope to see applications from all of you, and I'm looking forward to reviewing them. So that's it for today. Thank you. I'm going to